Hi everyone, welcome back to Science. Today is Wednesday, May 6th, 2020. If you followed the steps on this lesson, you should have already watched a short video on interdependency. That's a big word, isn't it? Interdependency. We will talk about that here in just a minute, but let's just review Monday. Monday, we talked about, and you watched a video on how all living things depend on a habitat to meet its needs for water, food, and shelter. You watched the video and you were to write something that you learned from the video, specifically on how an animal or a plant depend on its habitat to survive. I asked you to think about food and shelter, and these are some of the things that I heard in the video. I learned that otters go in the water for protection. Sometimes they might go underwater to get away from predators. Some animals, like the salamander, find shelter on the rocks. Then I also heard in the video that turtles use their shells for shelter and for protection. I think that's pretty cool. So now let's move on to our lesson today. I said you should have already watched a short video on interdependency. That was the first thing you should have done for this lesson. Now let's define interdependency. What does that mean? Interdependency, right here, that means how living and non-living things depend on each other to survive. So your job today is going to be to complete a tree chart. So let's go ahead and read our job. I will complete a tree chart to show how an animal or plant depend on something else for food and shelter. When I say tree chart, it's this right here. This is called a tree chart. Now, what you're going to need to do is you're going to need to pick an object that is found in nature. So a flower, some sort of plant, any sort of animal. So that's your first job, is to pick an animal or a plant found in nature. Then what we're going to do is, once you place that in here, I chose a flower. That's what I'm going to create my tree chart on. Now, I typed in here flower. Now I need to answer this question about the flower. You see how this arrow is pointing up to here? So it's asking, what depends on that? What depends on a flower? Well, we know that bees depend on a flower for food. Bees feed on the nectar found in a plant. You know, that's that sweet juice that's found in the flowers. We can also think about how the flower depends on a bee for pollination. What's pollination? I know we've heard that before, right? So a bee goes to a flower and it drinks its nectar. When it gets on the flower, the pollen sticks to the bee's body. So then this bee flies to a new flower, and when it lands on the new flower, that pollen that's on the bee rubs off onto the new flower. And so what the flower does with this pollen is it fertilizes the flower, and that flower makes seeds for new plants. So now let's go to the next section here. Remember, you see this arrow? So we know that bees depend on a flower. Now this next box is pointing up here. So what depends on bees? Or what might depend on flowers? So when we think about the bee, we know that animals depend on bees for pollination. Why? Well, if there wasn't any pollination, there wouldn't be new seeds growing, new plants. And we know that animals feed on berries and seeds and different fruits. So pollination makes food, and it makes food for these animals. So our different types of animals rely and they depend on bees to help with the pollination so that there's new growth of berries and seeds and fruits for food for the animal. Pollination also, it's growing new flowers, new bushes, new growth. It provides habitats for these animals and for these insects and birds. So now this next box, we ask, what depends on animals? Who or what depend? Well, we depend on animals, don't we? Humans depend on animals for food source. We also depend on animals for many other different things. If you have a farm, You depend on different types of animals to either work the farm. We use different types of animals for food. So this, guys, is a tree chart, and this is what you're going to create. So what you do is you start with this first box here, pick one object found in nature, either some sort of plant, a flower, or an animal, and then you come down to the next box and you ask, what depends on that? When it says that, it means what depends on the flower, and how does it depend? So bees depend on flowers. So you come in here and you write how it depends on the item above it. Then when you're finished with this box, you come down to the next box. You ask the question, what depends on that? It's pointing up. What depends on bees, in my case? So I tell you here, I explain how animals depend on bees. Then I come down to this next box here. If I can go further, then I will. If you can't go further, then you can stop. But then I ask the question again, what depends on animals? Well, we know humans depend on animals. So this is called interdependency. Remember, we talk about how living things depend on each other for survival, for food, for water, for shelter. So here is your page here. You'll open up your journal. You'll just, at the very top, you'll write object, and right here is where you're going to write what object you chose from nature, whether it's an animal, a squirrel, a bird, a snake, a turtle, or some sort of plant. And then this represents this area here. And again, if you stop here and you don't have anything else to add in the last box, that's okay. Okay, but the question you're asking is when you choose your object here, you're going to think about who or what depends on this object that I chose from nature. And you tell me how. Then you come down to the next box. And whatever object you chose here, you're going to ask the question, what depends on whatever I said here? And you explain how. And if you can go further down, then you come here and you think about whatever I put here, is there something that depends on what I put here? If so, you name the object and you explain how. Now if you get here and you can't think of something else, that's okay. You can stop here. So this is what your job is for today. You're going to complete a tree chart to show how an animal or a plant depend on something else for food and shelter. If you get stuck, not quite sure, please send me a message and we can work together to think of some ideas. But just think about that video that we watched. Think about the video from Monday. You can always go back to the Monday assignment and you can click into this video in your assignment, pull it up, and you can watch the video again to give you some different ideas of something that you can choose to create your tree chart. Hope you guys enjoy this activity. If you have any questions, feel free to reach out to me. I will be here to help you in any way that I can. Have a great day, guys. Goodbye.